Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast with Ron and Kristin, where leadership meets entertainment. This podcast features stories with names and certain aspects that have been changed to keep submissions private. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast, where leadership meets entertainment. Today, we are exploring one of the most challenging tests of leadership, and that's natural disasters and all that follows. I mean, we all know that recently Hurricane Helene made landfall in Florida. That was on September 26th. And that left a trail of destruction across 4 to 5 states with at least 40 confirmed deaths. And this storm has disrupted communities, devastated infrastructure, pushed leadership and emergency response teams to their limits. And as we dig into this situation, it's important to think beyond the immediate impact. Natural disasters like this don't just test the resilience of our infrastructure. They also reveal gaps in leadership, preparedness, and crisis management. And Ron, I know you talk about identifying gaps before they happen, putting together faux crises, right? And seeing how a team can manage. So we're going to unpack the broader implications of Helene's devastation and look at how leadership plays a critical role in navigating recovery efforts.
And you know, Kristin, there's everything from a lack of leadership to fraud. There's all kinds of things that aligns with the storm. But in this moment, you know, our hearts, our prayers and thoughts go out to all these people who are suffering. And I mean, they are suffering. I've heard horrendous stories of people being trapped on a building on top of a house. I mean, a lady holding a baby and she fell through. And when you say 40 deaths, we believe it's going to be a lot more, but you're right. Those are confirmed. And they're going to be finding more and more as the water recedes. Kristin, you know this, but this has been a little bit difficult in my world because 2 years ago, my parents lost their house for 56 years to a flood. And I mean, they lost everything. So now, even in southwestern part of Virginia, they've been without power this will be day 7. Wow. And my dad was finally able to get a generator. And by the way, he had generators, but when that other flood happened, he lost everything. So he's having to buy back piece by piece. So yesterday I get this text from my mom that the electricity came back on and she said I could just shout. And then 2 minutes later, it went back off, which is almost worse.
That is torture.
It is. So anyway, they are hopeful. Today is the day. The town has it. They live about a mile up on a hill. They moved away from where I grew up when the flood happened, but they live next to my sister. And, you know, they believe it's going to be restored sometime today. So I'm hoping to get that text message for them. But our prayers at the time we're recording this, it's devastating. And our thoughts and prayers are really with those people. Yeah. So let's delve into a little bit of conspiracy stuff. I know Kristin loves this, maybe more than me. She
definitely
believes in Martians and all kinds of stuff. I'm kidding.
Martians.
Well, I don't know.
Oh my gosh. He says he's kidding. No.
So
I believe in aliens.
If you get a Martian with a Dirty Side of Leadership t-shirt, don't be surprised.
Oh my goodness.
Just a day before Helene struck, a social media post went viral suggesting the hurricane was actually human-made. And the user referenced a 1947 hurricane named King, which was the subject of an experiment called Project Cyrus, where the U.S. Air Force and General Electric tried to modify weather by seeding clouds. They implied that the Hurricane Helene was another result of weather manipulation. And it's interesting, Kristin, but in the movie Forrest Gump, when Forrest talks about it rained for days and days and days, it was a reference, tongue-in-cheek reference to that experiment. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about AI, and this prompted me to do some research to see where our capabilities. We know that we can already do some weather manipulation, but it's worth people doing a deep dive if you're into that sort of thing. But it's like I've told you before, the first 10 things you're going to find on Google is not going to be where you're going to find that if you're interested. What say you there, Martian lover?
That's when Forrest Gump was like, it kept raining and raining and It even rained sideways. It even rained upside down. I love that movie. I'm sorry for the quotes. I could.
That was pretty good, Kristin.
Right? Thank you. Okay, this is kind of wild because, as many know, I'm on social media often, and I've been the victim of being labeled as misinformation, even for sarcastic quotes, yada yada. But this is really interesting. So as we're seeing, people are talking about how this may have been manipulated by lasers, and I can dive into that a little bit more. But there is a video out there, and it was CBS. They interviewed a professor, and he talked about using lasers to change the weather. And they say they ended this in the 80s, right? But this is literally 9 years ago. And he said physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to precipitate rain clouds and bring down even lightning bolts. And he did go on to say it's experimental, but it works. And it works by ripping apart the electrons and creating ions that act like seeds or like dust particles, and it brings down rain. And the only way for it to work is for there to already be precipitation, right? So when there's an existing storm, you can amplify it, right? So of course, experts are urging Americans that Hurricane Helene formed naturally and that it had nothing to do with cloud seeding. But there are valid questions concerning the hurricane's path, if you look into that. But, you know, you touched on this, Ron. So there's decades old projects like Storm Fury, which attempted to modify hurricanes through this cloud seeding that I just explained. And like I said, those were supposedly abandoned in the early 1980s because they were, quote unquote, ineffective and posed risks. But, you know, we've heard other countries talk about the fact that they use these as well. So, you know, you just never know.
You know, Kristin, you mentioned that you were going to be at some point in the Smoky Mountains, which is a place that I used to frequent. And the Native American population is pretty robust there, and they do a lot of performances, and they do rain dances and things like that. And, you know, back, I don't know if they still believe it, but they certainly believed it in early formation of our country that rain dances were effective. So
You're equating one to the other.
I'm saying no, goodness. I'm not. It just hit my mind, Kristin.
Yeah, you know, I'll be there. And so we bought a property, like an investment property in Eastern Tennessee. And we're going to be there in 2 weeks checking it out for the first time. We bought it a year ago. But it's funny, I called to see if they had any damage, right? Because it's really hard when you don't live somewhere. It's really hard to figure out what's going on there. And so I called and spoke with someone in the neighborhood. And I had to ask him to repeat himself because the accent was so thick. I was like, okay. I'm like, so did you get hit? Because I could barely understand it. So I absolutely love the East Tennessee accent. But you know, it's pretty wild for as much of Eastern Tennessee that was hit. Our area had nothing more than rain, apparently. But we'll be able to check it out for ourselves in a few weeks. So excited for that. Yeah,
that's good. All right. So let's talk about something more important than conspiracies. 2 million people are still without power. And I know we hear those numbers thrown out. We don't realize how many people that is. And thousands are displaced or missing. In the Carolinas, which, as most people that have been listening for a while know, that I live in the Charleston, South Carolina area. In the Carolinas, hundreds of roads remain impassable, severely hampering any rescue efforts. And that's the bad part. They can't get to them to rescue them or even provide food and supplies. And to add to the anxiety, meteorologists are already tracking another potential storm in the Gulf of Mexico. These kinds of situations highlight the importance of proactive leadership. It's one thing to respond after the fact, but the real test is how well prepared communities are before disaster strikes. Yeah. You guys that have been listening to Kristin and I know that we believe the government is displacing American tax dollars to an enormous extent, and we need to get officials from local all the way up to federal officials who reprioritize the way our funds, our money, our tax dollars are used. And one of the things I would argue is storm preparedness, infrastructure, and the things that are important to Americans. We're going to have a time of rebuilding. And as of right now, our infrastructure is terrible. And we always deplete our rescue funds every year, and those should be robust. What say you, Kristin?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So it's wild. I listen to a lot of political podcasts, and a theme that I hear is that our infrastructure in the United States is this is obviously within reason, but could be equated to a third world country in a lot of places. And when you go to Europe, apparently people that spend a lot of time there and they come back, it's pretty embarrassing. Airports, the bridges and, tunnel, just everything, subway systems. I haven't been to Europe, but I hear that we are far behind Asia as well. So the fact that infrastructure in the United States, supposedly the wealthiest country in the world, that we have let it slip to this point, and that's before these natural disasters, right? This natural disaster that's occurred recently, and that took out many bridges and roads, and so it's just really wild. It's embarrassing. So to your point, Ron, we need to reallocate and take a step back and look at where the money's going, and recovery is always more difficult in the communities that haven't received the proper investment in infrastructure and emergency planning. So they're playing catch up, if you will. And, we see federal and state leaders stepping in to provide some support. But the question remains, could more have been done in advance to mitigate the damage? We need to look at long-term strategies for disaster resilience, not just short-term relief efforts. That seems to be a trend. And I want to add that I don't see another country rushing in to help us financially. We send money all over the world, yet people are suffering right here. And I think it's important to think about that.
Yeah, no one ever reaches out financially. They will send us well wishes to stay on our good graces, but that's about all we get.
They'll hold space for us.
Yeah, and if you really look at our debt, not to get too political, but if you look at our national debt, we're at the point we need help. But that's okay. We'll continue to send our funds elsewhere.
Exactly.
So we talk a lot in leadership about creating crisis. You referenced it earlier, Kristin, and that's what local governments have to do. And one of the areas that is lacking, and we think we're so advanced with the internet, but just imagine for a moment, let's use a storm. It wipes out cell towers, internet connectivity. All of a sudden you are without your phone. You're without the internet. Of course, other things, power and all that goes with it. What are you going to do? And we have got to come up with alternative communication systems. I know of people right now, by the way, my brother-in-law, I still call him a brother-in-law, even though I divorced, I'm still, cordial with the family. He was missing. So his wife posted on Facebook, like, we need to figure out where he was, because he's an adventurer.
Goodness.
He goes into mountains, rides motorcycles, does all that stuff. So he and another guy were missing. Now they finally were able to report in, but they were stuck. They couldn't use their cell phone. And so we got to go back to the very basics here. And if you want to talk about leadership, we need some creative leadership. How are we going to communicate in times like this? And like I said, creating crisis. How do we respond? Now, don't get me wrong. There's complex issues, but let's be honest. We know that it's going to be wind and rain. We know that much. It's not like we have fire falling from the sky. So you start there and you figure out, but this would be a great one to use because in my lifetime, I don't remember the effects of a hurricane other than some rain coming in all this far into North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee to that level. I don't remember that happening. It may have. But the point is, you got to be ready for anything. All communities have to be ready. It's kind of like we joke when it snowed. It snowed like 10 years ago in Charleston, and it was a disaster because they're not accustomed to that. And there was all these funny memes of people driving up north and cars all over the roads in South Carolina. And it really was that way.
Oh my gosh.
And where I grew up in snow, I was driving to the store, and I remember I ran into a guy, so I kind of slid to a stop, and he's like, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to the grocery store." you need anything? He goes, I can't believe you're driving. I said, dude, it's flat.
Oh my goodness.
I grew up driving in mountains.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was just funny.
That is, I mean, even in the Northwest here, people are ridiculous. Even when it rains, and it rains all the time, it's like, wow, first rain of the season. There's so many car accidents. People just lose their minds. But I wanted to share this. This message was on X, or, what was it called for Twitter? But I thought this was good. This gal who lives in the path of Helene, she said, things that helped me survive: a gas stove, a gas car, a gas hot water heater, a gas chainsaw, and cash. And then she says things that would have been, or that were useless: electric cars, electric appliances, debit cards, the city bus, the government. Yeah, tax dollars going to Ukraine. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's different things we really do need to think about. We need to find gaps. I actually like when my power goes out for a few days, because then I find gaps. Like, I thought I had this like hand-powered phone charger. It's like a hand-powered generator. You literally have to like crank it. And that thing did not work. I got like 1% of my cell phone charged. So these types of, just like what you're saying, Ron, like doing like a stress test on your department to see how it's handled. I don't want to have my power out for 7 days like your folks. Like, that's an absolute nightmare. But I highly encourage, when folks have their power out for a short period of time, identify your gaps. What do you need? So I want to talk about, talking about on the topic of post-incident recovery, something's happening right now, and it's sure to negatively impact more folks that, than have already been impacted. And there are reports that truck drivers, and this is in Tennessee, all the reports are in Tennessee, truck drivers are stopping for the night, as they're required to, at truck stops, and they're having their tires slashed by an activist group. So 50 trucks containing food, supplies, and items used to stock shelves, grocery stores, and shops, etc. Shelves that are soon to go empty. They've had their tires slashed. So 50 at one stop, 25 at another. I believe there was another that had 7. So this has caused a major delay, and that's just a small percentage of it. And they say it's an activist group going around and slashing tires. So it just really makes me question what the motive is of this activist group. And especially timed, it's in Tennessee, that's already been completely hit by this storm. And these trucks are going to go stock shelves for towns and communities that need these supplies. So it just makes me really wonder what is happening here. I don't know if you know about this, Ron. There's supposedly a longshoreman strike. Also, Amazon's going to have a strike potentially coming up here. So talk about a storm. That is the perfect storm of empty shelves.
I was about to go into that. This port strike, some of them started early. Now, this is as we record this. This could change by the time this goes out. So keep that in mind, folks.
It's only 24 hours, though, so that's good. Well, hopefully not too much
We're
changes.
recording late this time.
Yeah.
Our producer is going to love us. But the AP reported that dock workers at ports from Maine to Texas began walking picket lines early Tuesday in a strike over wages and automation. Basically, they're being RoboCopped, is what they call it, when you're getting replaced by AI. Yeah. So this strike has huge potential. Kristin mentioned a few things, but because we love our listeners, you definitely want to make sure you've got candles, that you've got flashlights, that you've got matches and things that, in addition to what Kristin already mentioned. And the other thing I want to say, Kristin, before we go too far, is I'm going to put a couple links in our show notes of people that I know are credible places they can donate money.
Oh, that's amazing.
Because I am definitely going to donate. I want to do something to help. And we want to make sure that we're doing that, because we try to make all of our podcasts interesting, but don't take any of our joking or talking about anything else to minimize our concern for the people, because I told you I lived that nightmare with my parents 2 years ago, and I know what it's like when people get devastated. It's just horrendous. Right. And it also makes me angry. And let's touch on that just a little bit. When there is a natural disaster, there is so much that happens behind the scenes. There's a whole business ecosystem that profits from these events, and we can never forget that. You got the insurance industry, Insurance companies collect premiums from homeowners and businesses for years. When a disaster strikes, that's when the real test comes. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of times insurance companies, they pay out, but they have to be sued. I know all kinds of nightmare stories we don't have time to go into, but let's say they do pay out. Then what they do is raise premiums on everybody that's within. So now they're going to have a reason to add hurricane damage to areas that don't suffer hurricanes. You see what I'm saying? So they can add that to the insurance. You may have to pay hurricane insurance now, Kristin, when you get your place up and running in North Carolina.
I wouldn't doubt
Tennessee. For example, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, the insurance agency paid out nearly $19 billion. But those payouts didn't happen overnight. Many homeowners and businesses found themselves in prolonged battles with insurance companies, sometimes waiting months or even years to get the money. And again, I know story after story, so we won't.
So they just live in hotels for years?
That's the interesting part. My parents did get some funds from the state of Virginia. And they literally, it was almost the 2-year anniversary of the flood when they received the money.
Oh, wow.
So I explained to my mom and dad, and I told them, when they were discussing this, I said, well, you're talking about government issued funds. I wouldn't hold my breath.
Right.
And I've made numerous arguments. I know people think I might sound simple, but I worked for the federal government, and when you allow a mammoth bureaucracy to come into play, the money, there's all kinds of fraud. There are people that I know of stories of people charging 2 and 3 times the amount to help clean up. They're waiting for it, and God bless them because they do come and help these areas, but there's not enough checks and balances, so they triple charge. All you got to do is write down, I worked 50 hours in cleaning up this area, and there's no checks and balance.
So they're charging what, the township or the city or the state?
Well, it's usually the government funding. It's usually FEMA funding.
Okay.
It's almost impossible to monitor what happens. So the point we are making is storm cleanup is over $1 billion industry.
Right.
And you always have people who are ready to defraud when these things are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember the movie Twister?
Oh, yeah. And the new one came out.
Yeah. So the Twisters, right? And great soundtrack, by the way. I love that soundtrack. But anyways, so in the movie, one of the pieces was, oh gosh, I don't want to ruin it for everybody. But anyhow, it exposes basically how some companies they salivate for a natural disaster, right? And then they swoop in, and it's usually an insurance company, or sometimes not. And it's just the cleanup type companies. So anyways, that's highlighted in this movie. So it's Twisters, and it does go into that. So I actually found that really interesting. And that was a good remake. A lot of them are not. That one was actually pretty dang good. But yeah, it's a business. I mean, it's really wild, and it's sick to think about it. I am curious though, Ron. So like when people like your parents are displaced for, there's flooding. If you don't have family, if you don't have family to live with or stay with, like what do they have? Are they even able to stay in a hotel? Is there, FEMA gives those little trailer things?
Little trailer. That was what happened in Louisiana. It happens in a lot. Hurricane Katrina, I flew over, I went into Baton Rouge, and I saw all the FEMA trailers. And by the way, it ended up, there was like thousands of FEMA trailers that didn't get used. There's like
that's another business in itself.
Yeah, it's just a mess. And we've driven that point home. But because I got off base a little bit, I get really frustrated with this stuff. But there were people who literally had to just, especially in rural areas, just beg to stay with someone. And I'm sure that happened in metropolitan areas as well. And you beg to stay with someone. But if you don't have family, the funds are definitely not overnight unless you've got really great leadership and FEMA's ready to spring into action. But in the Appalachians, I made a joke in my book. We went through a flood in the 70s and late 70s. And I talked about how I helped my dad. He went house to house with the fire department cleaning. Like they would pull carpets out and hang them up over ropes and spray them. Because guess what? FEMA never arrived. And when you live in those rural areas, you learn to survive, and people take care of one another. So to answer your question, I've never seen storm relief really spring into action quickly.
Okay.
So people just have to survive until something happens.
Wow.
But the good thing is, like, I don't know how it is in metropolitan areas. I, of course, spent a lot of time in D.C., but in the country, people just kind of take care of one another.
Right.
It's kind of the philosophy. I wish we'd come back to that, by the way.
It's beautiful. I think that's a beautiful thing. And also just really helps solidify the importance of family and maintaining relationships with your family despite, political standings or, what. It
Right.
just, that, I really hope for people that they can really focus on family and understand that, you don't have to have those conversations at the dinner table, right? So it's so important to maintain those healthy relationships and put your differences aside, your blood, right? I just think I couldn't preach that enough. But I want to we're talking about FEMA here and government contracts and contractors. So FEMA, most people know, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's a critical player in disaster recovery. And its role, though, is a double-edged sword. On one hand, FEMA steps in to provide relief, like the million liters of water, 600,000 meals delivered to North Carolina in the wake of Hurricane Helene. But on the other hand, a significant portion of the billions that FEMA spends on disaster relief, it flows into the hands of large corporations. And we touched on that earlier. And as you can imagine, there can be a lot of funny business happening there. The corporations often have deep government ties. And while their services, yes, are crucial, the question arises, how much of this money actually reaches the people who need it most?
No, it's very true. And I think we've driven the point home. But the question that I get a lot of times is like, who do I donate to? Who can I trust?
Yes.
How much actually goes to the people?
Right.
Again, I'm going to put a couple places in show notes, but I will tell you that one of my good friends worked for Samaritan's Purse.
Oh, and, yes. They're wonderful.
It's Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son. And I know firsthand of the trucks, and they send people in as soon as they can clear out a way, because my friend went to multiple disaster sites. Now, he worked in the chaplaincy part where you provide the psychological. I mean, they have water and everything like that, because people forget this is way more than food, water, and electricity. People are traumatized. They've lost loved ones. So I loved what he did, because he was certified in crisis and stress management. And they would go in and take care of the emotional needs. But I can tell you, and he's told me multiple times, Samaritan's Purse is the real deal. And because he would set up next to the supply areas. So in other words, they're working simultaneous. You might get your supplies and come over to him, or vice versa. And he said those teams were amazing. So that will be one of the links, and that's probably where I'm going to send some money. I am checking in my local area. I feel a little bit of allegiance there.
Sure.
But that's one of the great agencies. And Katrina was the first, I guess, huge wake-up call that exacerbated all of this devastation that we're talking about. And we saw leaders stepping up, making a difference. Sometimes they do, and then we've seen it go days and weeks.
Yeah.
So Hurricane Ian hit Florida, and this was probably in my lifetime one of the amazing recoveries that I've ever seen. But that was in 2022, and Governor Ron DeSantis mobilized state resources almost immediately. The National Guard was called in, and I remember that there was a bridge, and he was saying, we're going to rebuild that like in 30 days. And I mean, that was mind-boggling to me. And it connected two areas. And sure enough, they built that bridge. So it can be done.
Incredible.
Now, I would say Florida, if anyone should know disaster, but let's give credit where credit's due. They mobilized and took care of that cleanup. It was unbelievable. It was amazing. And like I said, in my lifetime, that might have been the best response I've ever seen.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I remember watching that. I mean, the National Guard was deployed. Power was restored to nearly 2 million people within days.
Yeah.
And so it just really shows that his proactive approach was highly regarded. I mean, widespread praise right? Naturally. So it shows you that leadership can mitigate the impact of even the most severe storms. And, that's the kind of leadership that saves lives. And, on the other hand, happening right now, we're seeing significant challenges in places like Asheville, North Carolina, following Helene. The city is experiencing a total communication breakdown with over 600 people still unaccounted for. Cell service virtually non-existent, leaving families completely desperate for answers, right? You mentioned when your brother-in-law was missing for a short period of time. Like, I just can't imagine that happening for days and days on end. So that said, the mayor, who is a Democrat, just going to put that out there, said that emergency crews are relying on radios to communicate, and they've had to resort to passing notes just to coordinate basic services like water distribution. So it just shows you, same storm, 2 different towns, 2 different leaders, and you see completely different experiences.
No, it's true. And Kristin, I think we've driven the point home on leadership. You have to be prepared. You have to build up resources. You have to have communication. You have to be ready to respond. And frankly, you could do a comparison to a business. You have to take care of your people first. That's the first priority. And you have to create crisis and get the resources to do that. And any time that I see a hesitation, it is a direct reflection in those areas of the mayor of the town. It's a direct reflection of the governor, and then it's a direct reflection of the White House. And that is the hierarchy, because your local towns are your messengers. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like your more seasoned staff in these communities. And then you got your supervisor, your manager, that's your mayor. Right. And that's where the bulk of the communication, resource building, and the mayor has to reach out to get government funding or to build up, a surplus. What happens is people get so reliant on the federal government that they think when this happens, FEMA's going to step in or the federal government's going to step in, and they're not prepared.
Right.
And if you want to gauge leadership without getting political, I want you to look at the way they respond to storms. Look at their messaging. What's the messaging they're giving? Are they turning it into a photo op, or are they getting stuff done? And a lot of people say, oh, they show up for a photo op. Let me tell you something. When you're in a crisis, having your governor show up, it means something. It's a psychological thing. They can't go in there and make a difference, but you show up. And I've said that in my book. One of my dirty lessons was in disaster or in times of hurt, leaders show up, period. And so again, like I said, I think we could go on and on. I don't know what else you've got, Kristin, on.
Well, I think it's interesting because even at the bank, we had, imagine a bank system going down. You still have customers coming in, right? And so we had to prepare to make sure that when our systems go down, and they did, not very often, but they did, that we had a contingency plan in place. Now, this plan was in place, and every time we were audited, the auditors were making sure that the plan was in place, it was up to date, and that we all had a basic understanding of how to use it. And so when our systems went offline and we have customers coming in with thousands and thousands of dollars to withdraw and to deposit, you have to have this contingency plan. And so the whole point I'm trying to make is it's really important to have a plan, make sure it works. And then when something does happen, yes, it's stressful. It was not fun, but at least we had that backup plan and we knew how to use it. And I couldn't stress that enough. I know I briefly talked about banking on the last episode, but I will say, generally speaking, banks have their stuff together when it comes to these contingency plans. Naturally, it's money. You need to know what's coming in and out, right? And I just want to touch on the fact that vulnerable communities generally are going to suffer the most, right? And that's just unfortunately the truth of it. And we've been discussing leadership and recovery, and we can't overlook who bears the greatest burden in these disasters. And with most crises, it's the most vulnerable. It's low-income communities. It's the elderly, those without resources, and that includes those that don't have family around them or family around, period. Maybe it's because they don't talk, or maybe it's because they literally just don't have any. So, Hurricane Helene has made that abundantly clear that entire communities in the Carolinas have been cut off. Roads washed away, bridges destroyed, leaving them isolated without food, water, medical supplies. So I'm so glad that Ron was bringing up that different places to be able to donate to make an impact, because people like here on the West Coast, where we have pretty mild weather and we don't really know what it's like, knock on wood, to have something like this happen in our own backyard. We feel so helpless and want to be able to help. And I know that's the case for many. So I have to say the Samaritan's Purse, my late grandfather that was in Texas, he loved that organization. They volunteered regularly. And I know their church did as well. So that is, I second that, Ron.
Yeah. I don't know in all of our podcasts if we touched on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but that is really the basis of leadership, especially in local and federal government. But the first is physiological needs and biological requirements, such as air, food, shelter, clothing, the things you were talking about earlier. Where do people go? But that is the top priority. And if any leader has another priority, that tells you that they have misplaced priorities. The second is safety. People want to feel safe. And that goes into, there's a lot of crime and looting and all the stuff that happens during these storms. So you got to call out the National Guard, call out your state agencies and let them know. Now, they have families too. You got to be careful with this, but you got to have safety during these times, because my dad, and this is still really difficult for me to talk about, my dad, they lost their house, but he had a garage. It's like literally 200-300 yards down the road. It's where he grew up. So he still owns small property. He built that garage like from a mining company, and we put it together. It's 40 by 40, pretty good sized building. So he had that locked. Well, 2 weeks after the flood, some people broke in and stole all of his tools. They stole everything that you could carry out of there. And my mom told me, she said, I think that hurt your dad worse than losing the house, because my dad's always been, he's an electrical engineer. He was always working with his hands. And I think that hit me worse. So don't forget about safety when we're talking about, these natural disasters. And then, of course, it's love and belonging, and people need to be loved on during this time. And then you work on esteem. You help people rebuild their self-worth and understand you still got a purpose as you go through it. But I wanted to touch on that. But
oh my gosh,
Kristin,
I didn't know that, Ron. I don't feel like you shared that when that happened about the looting piece.
And I'm going to be honest with you, Kristin. I was so angry because we suspected some people who had addictions that did it. And because I lived close to the West Virginia line, so you could still in that area and then jump across state lines and sell things. So, but I'll be honest with you, Kristin, I wanted a door-to-door ministry. I wanted to go in and beat on doors. Especially I wanted to go to the people who I knew were, or at least were known to distribute drugs. They got caught up in all of that mess going on in the Appalachians with OxyContin and now fentanyl. But it wouldn't have been good for me to go over there. I was so angry. Right. So I probably did not talk about it, but I was deeply hurt and angry during that time. And that's why, by the way, that's why my dad did not have a generator now, because he had all that stuff, but he's had to piecemeal and buy some of his stuff back.
That is heartbreaking.
They had to relocate. It is heartbreaking.
And especially, I know tools, like I just cleaned out my grandpa's house and, in February, and his tools, he had like his great grandfather's tools. And right, a lot of men have tools that go back generations. I can imagine that for your father as well.
Yeah, my dad had thousands of dollars worth of tools, but there was something about him and his tools that was as strong as, my mother got our photo albums were upstairs. So she got that and she cried. She held those and cried for I don't know how long, because really that's all she was worried about. The rest of it she could redo. But anyway, I we've been through this, and it was a challenging thing. But I wanted to, people, I think from a leadership perspective, people are wondering, what can I do? So this is what I would say: pray for those people, and pray that doors will be open, that people will move and help and all of these things, but just pray for them. They need prayer. give. And we'll put a couple links in the show notes, but make sure you're giving somewhere reputable. Maybe you've got extended family there, but find a way to give. If you can physically help, it's needed. If you can get into those areas, you live on the borderline, or you want to travel, maybe you're in a situation where you can go help. Also, and this is a little bit of a shift, hold leaders accountable. If you see breakdowns, don't just forget about it. Once people get electricity going and then they just forget about it, hold your leaders accountable and let them know you did not respond in time during a devastating incident. So now you're not going to get reelected. We're going to have somebody that takes care of people's needs first.
Right.
And hold them accountable. Don't forget that, please. Yeah. That's my 2 cents.
I like
Kristin.
it, Ron. So we've explored the industries that profit from disaster recovery, from insurance companies to construction firms, and we've discussed how leadership and the lack of it can make or break a community's recovery. And I just think you'll learn a lot from something like this. And I also highly recommend going back and looking at the history of natural disasters that have occurred. And when you saw leadership step up, what did they do that made the community recover faster?
Right.
And what were, like Katrina, some of the really negative experiences, right? So that is a whole separate study. We study war a lot, right? Just as a collective, it's interesting. But go study natural disasters and you will learn a lot about a lot. And so I'm going to be out in that area in a few weeks. And I had told one of my friends who lives in he lives in Florida, but the Tampa area. And I'd said, hey, if the need still exists, I will come meet you and we'll, do a soup kitchen or whatever is available. I'm happy to help. So, wish I could do more, but I have a feeling the need will still exist in 2 weeks' time.
This thing's going to be months and months to come. So absolutely. Well, everyone, if you've stuck with us, we really, really appreciate it. And we hope that we can all do our small part to make a difference. And Kristin and I are always excited to do this. We hope you will rate. I do have a lot of people who tell me they watch on YouTube, so that's fine. It doesn't help us in our podcast ratings, but
go double dip.
I know they like to look at me, Kristin, so I just live with it.
Nice.
So anyway, if you subscribe to YouTube, it certainly doesn't hurt. Who knows? We may shift more toward YouTube at some point anyway.
We'll make you little reels or what are they called on YouTube? Shorts. We'll make some YouTube shorts. Yeah,
we're going to make some more YouTube shorts. And don't forget, if you DM us, if you rate the podcast and DM us, Kristin has taken it upon herself if you will DM us your color, size, and your address.
Yeah.
Kristin will send you a t-shirt, and it's happening. People are thrilled with these t-shirts, and it helps us, of course, promote the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. And I've been sending them. Gosh, I sent 4 out 2 days. Yesterday. Was it yesterday? Yeah, I sent 4 out yesterday or the day before. And so, let's keep those reviews coming in. I'm sending them out pretty dang quickly after I get it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Be the leader you're meant to be.
We'll see you next week.
The Dirty Side of Leadership podcast is brought to you by Forward Operations. If you'd like to book Ron or Kristin for speaking events, training, or executive coaching, visit forwardoperations.com. Be the leader you're meant to be.